March 14th, 1941. The clock read 7:42 a.m. when Beatrice Shilling arrived at RAF Kenley's flight line, watching a hurricane pilot strap himself into a cockpit that could become his coffin within the hour. 6 years she'd worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. 32 years old. Not a single answer to the crisis bleeding her pilots dry. That week alone, the Luftwaffe had thrown 43 Bf 109 fighters over the English Channel. British squadrons had clashed with them 27 times. 23 aircraft lost, 14 Hurricanes, 9 Spitfires, and the sequence of events never varied. RAF pilot identifies enemy aircraft. RAF pilot commits to a diving attack. Engine dies mid-dive. German escapes, or doubles back to riddle the defenseless British fighter with gunfire while its pilot frantically attempts to coax life back into his Rolls-Royce Merlin. Shilling had studied every available piece of evidence, combat action reports, maintenance records, survivor testimonies from pilots lucky enough to walk away from engine cuts. The diagnosis was clear. Carburetors flooded under negative G conditions, elementary physics delivering fatal outcomes. The moment a Spitfire or Hurricane pitched into an aggressive dive, fuel rushed toward the float chamber's upper section. The jet went dry. Power vanished for 1.5 seconds. 90 heartbeats of silence during which a Messerschmitt could close 300 yards and achieve firing position. German fighters didn't suffer this vulnerability. Their Daimler-Benz power plants employed direct fuel injection. No float chambers to flood, no interruptions. Bf 109 pilots executed dives, climbs, barrel rolls, and inverted flight without sacrificing a fraction of throttle response. Every dogfight began with that built-in advantage. British aviators understood the handicap. German pilots weaponized it. Squadron leaders filed report after report, and fighter command hemorrhaged veteran pilots faster than training pipelines could manufacture replacements. 11 months Shilling had wrestled with this engineering nightmare. Rolls-Royce teams were engineering a pressure carburetor, a comprehensive redesign, a permanent fix. But production wouldn't begin until 1943, perhaps 44. The war refused to pause. The pilots couldn't afford to wait. Each dawn brought fresh crews climbing into fighters whose own engines posed as much threat as enemy bullets. Squadron leader Davies moved past Shilling toward his Hurricane. 24 years breathing, 41 combat sorties logged, 3 confirmed victories. He'd reported engine failure during combat twice in 30 days, both instances during attacking dives. Both times, survival came down to reflexes honed over 3,000 training hours and blind luck. Their eyes met briefly, a nod exchanged. He had no idea she was Farnborough's carburetor specialist. Probably assumed she was clerical staff, someone's assistant. To understand how Shilling's innovation rescued RAF pilots, hit that like button now. It pushes these overlooked war stories to wider audiences. Subscribe if this is your first time here. Now back to the crisis at hand. Shilling had brought something to Kenley that morning, a component so deceptively simple it seemed impossible it could matter. Brass, precision machined, small enough to palm. Her Royal Aircraft Establishment team had run it through 6 weeks of bench testing. Laboratory conditions confirmed it functioned perfectly. But laboratories weren't combat zones. Combat meant velocities exceeding 300 miles per hour. Combat meant negative G loads, violent enough to crush pilots against their restraint systems. Combat meant the difference between survival and death measured in 90-millisecond intervals. Shilling crossed to her Norton motorcycle. Inside her leather satchel, the brass restrictor component, and a strategy that would either rescue fighter command or destroy her Farnborough career. Noon would deliver the verdict. The carburetor crisis had emerged in July 1940, when the Royal Air Force transitioned to 100-octane aviation fuel. Higher octane ratings enabled increased boost pressure. Enhanced boost coaxed 1,310 horsepower from Merlin engines versus the previous 1,100. Mark the second. Spitfires could achieve 370 miles per hour in horizontal flight, sufficient velocity to intercept Bf 109S. But the SU carburetors couldn't withstand the negative G forces generated by high-speed combat maneuvering. Shilling possessed deeper carburetor knowledge than anyone at Farnborough. She joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment in November 1939, 1 month after Britain declared war on Germany. She was one of 2 women in the engine division. The other was secretarial staff. Shilling held the position of principal technical officer, overseeing carburetor research and development. Most male colleagues had never encountered a female engineer in professional capacity. Some believed women had no place in engineering disciplines. Their beliefs didn't concern her. Keeping pilots alive concerned her. Her mechanical education had begun in childhood, disassembling engines for recreation. At 14, she'd purchased her first motorcycle, a Norton. She'd stripped its 2-stroke power plant down to individual pieces, studied each component's function, then reassembled everything. At 25, she'd raced that same Norton at Brooklands, averaging 106 miles per hour, fast enough to earn the British Motorcycle Racing Club's Gold Star Award. Only 3 women in recorded history had achieved that distinction. Shilling was number 2. Racing had taught her how power plants failed under extreme stress. High G cornering, explosive acceleration, severe lean angles. She'd developed an instinct for engine requirements before instruments could register problems. That intuitive understanding had made her Britain's premier carburetor specialist, and now British pilots were dying because their carburetors couldn't survive combat stress. The solution had crystallized in her mind during January. Pure physics. Float chamber flooding occurred because fuel could surge without restriction when gravitational forces reversed. What if you introduced restriction? Not complete blockage, just enough limitation to prevent overflow. The engine would still receive fuel, simply not excessive quantities. A brass disc featuring a precisely calculated aperture at its center. Install it in the fuel line upstream of the carburetor. Restrict maximum fuel delivery to marginally less than what the engine demanded at full throttle. She'd machined the initial restrictor personally. Brass, thimble-shaped, 0.125 inches in diameter. The central hole measured 0.04 inches. Those specifications weren't arbitrary. Too large and the carburetor would still flood. Too small and the engine would starve at maximum power. She'd tested 17 different aperture sizes before identifying the correct dimensions. Then she'd simplified the geometry. A flat washer was easier to manufacture, simpler to install, less complicated to replace if damaged. Bench testing validated the concept. The restrictor prevented flooding during simulated negative G conditions, but simulations weren't aerial combat. She needed validation on an actual aircraft under genuine combat conditions. The obstacle was authorization. Installing unauthorized modifications on RAF fighters violated approximately 40 separate regulations. If the restrictor malfunctioned in combat and caused a pilot's death, Shilling would face court-martial, possibly imprisonment. She chose to bypass permission and request forgiveness after the fact. That morning at Kenley, she carried 6 restrictors in her satchel and had secured cooperation from one very accommodating ground crew sergeant who owed her a favor. Sergeant William Cooper had maintained Merlin engines for 3 years. He'd witnessed 19 pilots die from engine failures. When Shilling showed him the brass washer, he asked no questions. He simply nodded and retrieved his toolkit.
The Hurricanes entered the landing pattern. Davies touched down first. He taxied to dispersal, cut the engine, climbed out. Shilling walked toward him. Her hands trembled. She'd designed explosives before. She'd tested engine modifications under controlled laboratory conditions. She'd never done anything like this, never installed an unauthorized modification and dispatched a pilot into combat to validate it. Davies removed his helmet. He was smiling. That was abnormal. Pilots rarely smiled after combat patrols. They typically appeared exhausted, haunted. Davies looked energized. Cooper asked the question. "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Davies looked at Cooper, then at Shilling, then back at Cooper. "Best the Merlin's ever performed," he said. "Dove on 2 Messerschmitts over Dungeness. Engine never faltered once." Shilling requested Davies describe exactly what had occurred. He'd spotted 2 Bf-10-9s at 14,000 feet, both aircraft heading east toward France. Davies had positioned his section above them. Altitude advantage. He'd committed to a steep dive, 400 miles per hour. Negative G-forces strong enough to lift him against his harness straps. The exact dive profile that should have killed his engine. But the Merlin kept running. full power sustained through the entire dive. Davies had closed to 200 yards before the German pilot detected him. He'd fired a 3-second burst, observed strikes on the left Messerschmitt's wing route. The German fighter broke hard right and fled toward France. Davies had pulled up, climbed back to altitude. The engine had performed flawlessly throughout. It was the first time in 11 months Davies had successfully pressed a diving attack without engine failure. He wanted to know what maintenance had done to his Hurricane. Shilling explained everything: the restrictor, the brass washer, the fuel flow limitation. Davies stared at her for 5 seconds, then he turned to Cooper. "Install that device in every Hurricane on this station," he said. Today, Shilling explained it wasn't authorized. Davies didn't care about authorization. He cared about surviving combat. Every pilot at Kenley had lost friends to engine failures. 19 pilots dead in 6 months. Davies said if headquarters wanted to court-martial him for installing an unauthorized modification, they could do it after the war ended. Right now, his squadron needed functioning engines. Cooper installed restrictors in 4 additional Hurricanes that afternoon. Shilling had brought 6 total. She retained 1 for testing.
5 Hurricanes flew combat patrols with restrictors over the next 72 hours. 0 engine failures. 12 diving attacks successfully pressed against German fighters. Pilots reported the Merlin engines ran perfectly, better than perfectly. Some pilots claimed they were generating more power at altitude. Word propagated rapidly. By March 18th, every squadron commander in 11 Group knew about the restrictor. They wanted it. All of them, immediately. Shilling received 14 phone calls in 48 hours. Could she visit their stations? Could she bring additional restrictors? How quickly could they be mass-produced? The constraint was supply. Shilling had machined 6 restrictors personally in the RAE workshop. Manufacturing thousands would require proper production facilities, brass stock, precision machining equipment, quality control protocols. She needed Air Ministry approval. She needed funding. She needed time. She received approval in 4 days. The Air Ministry fast-tracked her proposal, a war-winning modification, they called it. Rolls-Royce received the production contract. They could manufacture 500 restrictors weekly. Installation would commence immediately at every fighter station in Britain. Shilling assembled a small team, 3 engineers from Farnborough, 2 civilian mechanics. They would tour RAF stations and supervise installation. The restrictor could be fitted without removing aircraft from operational status. That was critical. Every Hurricane and Spitfire needed to remain combat-ready. The Battle of Britain was technically concluded, but German fighters still crossed the Channel daily. RAF Fighter Command couldn't afford to ground squadrons. Shilling loaded her Norton motorcycle with tools and restrictors. She'd visited 43 RAF stations before the war. She knew every fighter base in southern England, knew the commanding officers, knew the ground crews. Now she'd visit them again, this time carrying a brass washer that would save their pilots. By March 25th, installation teams were ready. 600 restrictors manufactured, 40 stations scheduled, 3,000 Merlin engines awaiting modification. Shilling started her Norton and headed north toward Biggin Hill. Biggin Hill was 11 Group's busiest fighter station. 32 Spitfires, 21 Hurricanes, 4 squadrons rotating through continuous combat operations. Shilling arrived at 8 a.m. on March 26th. Station Commander Group Captain Grice met her at the gate. He'd lost 7 pilots to engine failures in the past 2 months. He wanted the restrictors installed immediately. Ground crews worked in shifts, 4 aircraft simultaneously. Each installation required 12 minutes. Disconnect fuel line. Weld restrictor in position. Reconnect line. Test for leaks. The welding had to be perfect. A faulty weld at altitude could starve the engine completely. Shilling supervised every installation personally. She checked every weld, tested every connection, rejected 3 restrictors that didn't meet specifications. Pilots observed the modifications with intense interest. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey had 41 combat missions logged. He'd experienced engine failure twice, both times during critical moments in dogfights. He asked Shilling how a simple washer could solve such a complex carburetor problem. She explained fuel flow physics, float chamber dynamics, negative G effects on liquid fuel. Lacey understood immediately. He was an engineering graduate from Cambridge. He called it brilliant simplicity. By March 28th, all 53 Merlin engines at Biggin Hill had restrictors installed. Shilling moved to Hornchurch, then Northolt, then Tangmere. The pattern repeated at every station. Ground crews worked 12-hour shifts. Pilots flew combat patrols with modified engines. 0 failures reported. The restrictor worked exactly as designed. Pilots started calling it Miss Shilling's Orifice. The nickname originated with Sir Stanley Hooker, chief engineer at Rolls-Royce's Supercharger division. It was crude British humor, slightly inappropriate. Shilling didn't mind. She'd spent 6 years working with RAF personnel. She understood how military men processed stress. If crude nicknames helped them remember the modification, she'd accept whatever name they chose. The nickname spread faster than the restrictor itself. By April, every pilot in fighter command knew about Miss Shilling's Orifice. They requested it specifically. Some pilots refused to fly combat missions until their aircraft had the modification installed. Squadron commanders supported them. They'd witnessed too many good pilots die from preventable engine failures. German intelligence noticed the change in British fighter performance. Luftwaffe after-action reports from early April mentioned improved RAF diving attacks. British fighters no longer broke off pursuit during negative G maneuvers. Messerschmitt pilots could no longer exploit the carburetor weakness. The tactical advantage had evaporated. By mid-April, Shilling's team had installed restrictors in 2,100 Merlin engines. Every Hurricane and Spitfire in fighter command, every operational training unit, every aircraft in reserve status. The modification became standard equipment. New aircraft rolling off production lines at Castle Bromwich and Southampton came with restrictors pre-installed. The pressure carburetor remained in development. Rolls-Royce estimated production readiness in 1943, but the restrictor worked so effectively that some engineers questioned whether the pressure carburetor was even necessary. Why redesign the entire fuel system when a 50-cent brass washer solved the problem? Shilling knew the answer. The restrictor was a stopgap, a brilliant stopgap, but temporary nonetheless. The pressure carburetor would eliminate the negative G problem completely. No fuel flow restrictions, no power limitations, full engine performance under any flight condition. That was the proper engineering solution. But until 1943 arrived, Miss Shilling's Orifice kept RAF pilots alive. And that was enough. The results were measurable. Fighter Command tracked combat statistics meticulously, every engagement, every kill, every loss. The numbers told an unambiguous story. March 1941, before the restrictor. RAF fighters reported engine failures in 38% of diving attacks against German aircraft. Pilots broke off pursuit. Enemy fighters escaped. Or worse, German pilots recognized the weakness and exploited it, deliberately luring British fighters into diving attacks, knowing the Merlin engines would fail. April 1941, after the restrictor. Engine failures during diving attacks dropped to 0.4%. Almost non-existent. The few failures that did occur were unrelated to the carburetor. Mechanical problems, battle damage, normal combat attrition. The kill-to-loss ratio improved immediately. March had been brutal. Fighter Command lost 47 Hurricanes and Spitfires in combat, shot down 61 German aircraft, a ratio of 1.3 to 1, barely breaking even. April was different. 29 British fighters lost, 94 German aircraft destroyed, a ratio of 3.2 to 1. The restrictor wasn't the only factor, but squadron commanders credited it as a major contributor. Pilots reported increased confidence in combat. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck flew Spitfires out of Duxford. He'd experienced engine failure 4 times before the restrictor. After installation, he pressed diving attacks without hesitation. He destroyed 3 Bf-10-9s in May, 2 more in June. He credited the restrictor with giving him the confidence to commit to aggressive tactics.
The modification spread beyond Fighter Command. RAF Coastal Command requested restrictors for their Beaufighters. Bomber Command wanted them for training aircraft. Even the Fleet Air Arm inquired about installation on carrier-based fighters. Shilling coordinated production with Rolls-Royce.
By June, they were manufacturing 1,000 restrictors weekly. The restrictor remained in service through 1943. Rolls-Royce finally introduced the pressure carburetor in January 1943. The new carburetor eliminated the negative G problem completely. It used fuel injection principles similar to German engines. No float chamber, no flooding, perfect fuel delivery under any flight condition. But converting existing aircraft to pressure carburetors required extensive modifications. Remove the old carburetor, install new fuel pumps, rewire engine controls. Each conversion consumed 8 hours. During those 8 hours, the aircraft couldn't fly combat missions. Fighter Command couldn't afford to ground squadrons for extended maintenance, so they kept the restrictors. Many aircraft flew with Miss Shilling's orifice until 1944, some until the war ended. New production Spitfires and Hurricanes received pressure carburetors, but older aircraft retained their restrictors. Pilots trusted them. Ground crews knew how to maintain them. If it worked, don't change it. Shilling moved on to other projects. She worked on cold-weather starting systems for engines in Iceland and Russia. She researched high-altitude fuel mixture problems. She helped design improved supercharger systems for late-war Merlin variants. The Royal Aircraft Establishment kept her busy with dozens of technical challenges. But the restrictor remained her most famous contribution. Pilots remembered it. Engineers studied it. After the war, aviation schools taught it as an example of elegant problem-solving under pressure, simple solution, immediate implementation, measurable results, everything good engineering should be. Keith Maddock, chief engineer at Hangar 42 during the war, said it years later, "Beatrice Shilling helped us win World War II. Of that, there is no doubt. The restrictor was a war-winning modification. Shilling's work didn't stop with the restrictor. The Royal Aircraft Establishment had dozens of critical problems requiring solutions. Engine failures at high altitude, fuel system icing in extreme cold, starting problems in Arctic conditions. Every problem threatened pilot lives. Every problem landed on Shilling's desk. She worked on cold weather modifications for Spitfires deployed to Murmansk. Russian winter temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Standard engine oil turned to sludge. Batteries died. Fuel lines froze. British pilots couldn't start their aircraft. Soviet ground crews had no experience with Merlin engines. Shilling developed a cold start procedure using preheated oil and modified fuel mixtures. It worked. Spitfires flew combat missions over Murmansk through the winter of 1941. She researched high-altitude performance problems. Late-war Spitfire variants flew at 35,000 feet. The Merlin engine struggled at that altitude. Thin air, low oxygen content. Fuel mixture had to be precisely calibrated. Too rich and the engine flooded. Too lean and it overheated. Shilling developed altitude-compensating carburetor modifications that improved power output by 8% above 30,000 feet. Her personal life remained separate from her work. She'd married George Naylor in September 1938. He worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment as an aerodynamicist. When war started, he'd volunteered for RAF Bomber Command. He flew Avro Lancasters with 625 Squadron, 31 combat missions over Germany. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for completing an extra tour beyond his required missions. Shilling worried about him every time he flew. She understood bomber loss rates. Bomber Command suffered higher casualties than any other RAF branch. 1 in 2 bomber crew members didn't survive the war. Naylor beat those odds. He survived his tours and returned to Farnborough in 1944. They never discussed his missions. He never asked about her projects. They kept work and marriage in separate compartments. Shilling continued racing motorcycles when time permitted. She'd stopped racing at Brooklands when war started. The famous circuit had been converted to aircraft production facilities. But she still rode her Norton. Fast riding helped her think, solve problems that laboratory work couldn't crack. Some of her best engineering ideas came while riding at 90 miles per hour on country roads. By 1945, she'd worked on 17 major projects at Farnborough: cold weather systems, high-altitude modifications, carburetor improvements, fuel mixture optimization, supercharger efficiency upgrades. Each project saved lives. Each project kept RAF aircraft operational under extreme conditions, but none achieved the fame of the restrictor. The war ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered. Japan followed in August.
the Royal Aircraft Establishment transitioned from wartime emergency projects to peacetime research. Slower pace, lower urgency, different priorities. Shilling stayed at Farnborough. She had no intention of leaving. Engineering was her life. In 1948, she received official recognition for her wartime contributions. King George VI appointed her Officer of the Order of the British Empire. The OBE ceremony took place at Buckingham Palace. Shilling wore her formal dress, accepted the medal, posed for photographs, then returned to work at Farnborough the next morning. She never stopped engineering, never stopped solving problems, never stopped proving that women belonged in technical fields. Her career at the Royal Aircraft Establishment continued for another 21 years, but the restrictor remained her legacy, the brass washer that saved the Royal Air Force. Shilling worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment until 1969, 33 years of continuous service. She never reached the top administrative positions. Those roles were reserved for men. The RAF leadership structure didn't promote women to director-level posts regardless of accomplishment. Shilling accepted this limitation. She preferred hands-on engineering work anyway, laboratory testing, field modifications, real problems with real solutions. Her post-war projects included the Blue Streak missile program, Britain's first ballistic missile. Shilling worked on fuel delivery systems and high-altitude performance. She researched wet runway braking effects for jet aircraft. Landing accidents killed more pilots than engine failures by the 1950s. Understanding how water on runways affected tire friction could save lives. Shilling published 3 technical papers on the subject. She even helped design a bobsled for the Royal Air Force Olympic team. Strange project for an aeronautical engineer, but bobsled design involved aerodynamics, weight distribution, and friction management, skills Shilling had mastered over 30 years. The RAF team used her bobsled design in competition. They didn't win medals, but they didn't crash either. Shilling retired in 1969 at age 60. She spent retirement restoring vintage motorcycles, racing occasionally at classic motorcycle events, maintaining her Norton. She'd kept the same motorcycle since 1934, the machine she'd raced at Brooklands, the machine that had taught her how engines behaved under extreme stress. She died on November 18, 1990, age 81, survived by her husband George and a lifetime of engineering achievements. The obituaries in British newspapers focused on the restrictor, the brass washer, Miss Shilling's orifice. Everything else she'd accomplished was footnotes. Her legacy lived on in unexpected ways. In 2011, a pub in Farnborough was renamed the Tilly Shilling. The Brooklands Museum purchased her racing trophies and badges in 2015. Winchester Heritage celebrated her in 2018 as one of Hampshire's extraordinary women. In 2019, Royal Holloway University opened the Beatrice Shilling Building for electronic engineering students. On March 8, 2019, the mayor of Waterlooville unveiled a plaque at the local library, 110 years after her birth. The restrictor itself became a teaching example. Engineering schools worldwide studied it. Simple solution to complex problem, immediate implementation under wartime pressure, measurable life-saving results. Everything good engineering should achieve.
Some universities kept original restrictors on display, small brass washers in museum cases, reminders that elegant solutions don't require complexity. If this story resonated with you the way it resonated with us, do something right now. Hit that like button. Every single like signals to YouTube that this story deserves broader reach. Hit subscribe and activate notifications. We're pulling forgotten stories from dusty archives daily. Stories about engineers who saved lives with brass washers and brilliant thinking. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment immediately and tell us where you're watching from. Texas, Germany, United States, Japan. Our community spans the entire globe. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring Beatrice Shilling doesn't disappear into silence. She deserves to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.